I'm Max Brantley with the Arkansas Times. It's Tuesday, February the 3rd, and we have news headlines from Little Rock and Arkansas. I mentioned yesterday, and we've elaborated a great deal more on the Arkansas blog today, about an interesting idea that's still largely under wraps, but we found out a lot of details about. And that's an idea to move the Arkansas Arts Center from Little Rock to North Little Rock. There's a plan cooking in which North Little Rock would raise its sales tax to produce perhaps $60 million. Private investors, probably the Stevens family, would invest $40 million, maybe more, and build a $100 million multiple building arts complex on the banks of near the banks of the Arkansas River in downtown North Little Rock as a tourism and artistic lure. Might even include a theater. There's at least some conceptual talk about moving some of the Arkansas Repertory Theater there. At this point, mostly we're getting no comments, but there's no doubt this is being talked about. There's a survey underway to see if voters would approve a tax measure that had a limited span, 10 years. It was partially for this theater museum proposal and partially for police and fire equipment. North Little Rock's used that kind of strategy before. Some of this is motivated by the need for a great deal of work at the Arts Center in MacArthur Park. Some of it's a feeling that the Little Rock city government isn't responsive. I can tell you that based on our talks today, that Little Rock government isn't very happy about losing its premier arts institution, and I think there'll be further discussions. Would I predict that this is going to come true? Don't know, but as I wrote today on the blog, I think it's good to be having a debate about a $100 million community investment and not about some disaster. So there's going to be a lot of interesting developments before that's over. Attorney General Leslie Rutledge announced today that the state will get $21.5 million from a settlement of a national lawsuit against Standard & Poor's over its inflated ratings of some risky mortgage securities. It's kind of interesting because this is really Dustin McDaniel's lawsuit. It was actually carried in Arkansas by an attorney that was fired by Leslie Rutledge when she took office, Jim DePriest. Also, it's interesting because the money is going to go into her Consumer Protection and Education Fund, which was created by Dustin McDaniel through state legislation as sort of a slush fund for the Attorney General. She's not been a friend in some of the things she's said about such class action lawsuits in the past. She might take a different view with $21.5 million in her hip pocket. The private option bill, extending it for 2 years and setting up a task force to look at different ways of doing health care in Arkansas, came out of a House committee today easily on a voice vote. It had already passed the Senate. I think Asa Hutchinson looks even more likely today to continue the private option expansion of Medicaid without any trouble whatsoever. This after seeing 10 or 15 members of the legislature change seats to Republicans strongly on the strength of their promise not to vote for the private option. No way, no how, no time. Also good news for Asa Hutchinson is the monthly revenue report from the state. Income is way up from taxes. That means it's even more likely than he already expected that there'll be money on hand to pay for his big income tax cut. Other bills of the legislature are not so fun to talk about. There are two different bills, one aimed at local government, one aimed at state government. They're styled as religious protection bills or conscience protections bills. What they are, nothing more or less than institutionalizing the ability to discriminate legally against gay people in employment, housing, and public accommodations. They're sponsored by religious right Republicans. They're meant to protect discrimination. There are organizations that are rising up to issue statements against it. I expect the bills will pass. As I've said, this is a place where Governor Hutchinson could place his moderating hand. It's not that anybody's going to be harmed by not having this legislation, but people will be directly harmed by having it, and it sends a bad message. It'll be interesting to see if he happily signs these bills or sends a message otherwise. It comes at a particularly poignant time because we got a news story out of Dallas yesterday that a gay man who grew up in Arkansas and died of a genetic disorder, wanted to be buried back home in Baxter County. The report is from the preacher who did the ceremony that he was refused the use of churches in Mountain Home for a funeral for a gay man. If churches didn't allow funerals for people they believed had sinned in their lifetimes, there wouldn't be many funerals in churches. Isn't that what we're taught? Very interesting finding by BuzzFeed. They have dug up a series of columns written by Mike Huckabee when he was just out of Hope High School, a young Baptist preacher and student at Ouachita Baptist, and he wrote for the Baptist Missionary Association some columns aimed at young people. He was very, very disapproving of dancing and soap operas, among other things. You know, we all say a lot of things when we're young that we live to regret. I think in some ways you could see sort of the somewhat moderate Mike Huckabee in his writings, but he certainly was a hidebound guy. He wasn't ready to say that dancing would lead to people hopping into bed together, but he said he was sure it would lead to temptation, and who knows where that leads. And finally, the subject of Mike Huckabee somehow reminds me of another pressing municipal concern. There's a Canada geese problem at MacArthur Park. They're leaving all kinds of messy stuff around the grounds, and the city has announced what it thinks is a non-humane barrier that'll drive them away from the fish pond at MacArthur Park. We'll be updating this story for you as often as possible. I'm Max Brantley. I won't be back tomorrow. I'm going to San Francisco for a conference, but we'll try to keep the TV coming. Thanks a lot.